What happens inside your brain in the last moments before you die? Not the philosophical version of that question, the actual, measurable, electrical version, because scientists have recorded it. And what they found is so strange that even the researchers weren't sure what to make of it. And this video is about what your brain actually does as it shuts down. Most people assume it's a slow fade, like a TV losing signal. But the data tells a completely different story, and some of it will genuinely change how you think about death. I've gone through the neuroscience papers, the EEG studies, the Yale experiments, all of it. So here's what we actually know. Let's start with the study that kicked all of this off, because the way it happened is almost as strange as what it found. In 2022, an 87-year-old man was being monitored for seizures when he had a fatal heart attack mid-recording. Nobody planned this. It just happened while the EEG was running, and that made it the first continuous brain recording ever captured across the full transition from alive to dead in a human being. What the researchers saw in the 30 seconds around his heart stopping was a surge of gamma waves, the same high-frequency waves your brain produces during intense focus and memory retrieval. But here's the part that really matters. Those gamma waves weren't random. They were being organized by alpha waves in the exact same cross-frequency coupling pattern the brain uses when you're consciously recalling a memory. The machinery your brain uses to replay your past fired one last time on the way out. The life review that people describe in near-death experiences might not be a metaphor. It might be a neurological event. That's remarkable on its own. But if you don't also know where in the brain that surge was happening, you're missing the most important piece. The gamma surge wasn't scattered randomly across the brain. It was concentrated most strongly in a region called the temporoparietal occipital cortex, sometimes called the posterior hot zone. And that specific region is exactly where many neuroscientists believe conscious experience is physically generated. The part of your brain most tied to subjective awareness, to the feeling of being you, was the last thing to light up. The final electrical flare wasn't noise, it was organized, it was purposeful looking, and it was happening in the one place where consciousness is thought to live. Now here's where it gets even stranger, because this wasn't just one patient and one data point. Back in 2013, researchers at the University of Michigan induced cardiac arrest in rats while monitoring their brain activity. What they expected was a gradual dimming. What they found was the opposite. In the seconds after the heart stopped, front-to-back brain connectivity jumped to 5 to 8 times stronger than during normal waking life. The low gamma waves became twice as synchronized as they ever were, while the rats were alive. To be fair, critics point out that the total electrical power is tiny, so saying the brain is more conscious than ever at the moment of death overstates it. But the coherence spike is real, and it's been replicated. The brain doesn't just quietly power down. Something organized and intense happens first. But here's what nobody talks about when they mention these studies. Death doesn't hit your brain all at once. It moves through it. There's a phenomenon called terminal spreading depolarization, and some researchers call it the wave of death. It starts deep in layer 5 of the neocortex, in the neurons with the highest energy demands, the ones that burn out first when oxygen stops arriving, and then it spreads outward in 2 directions at a few millimeters per minute. You can literally watch death travel across a brain. It has a direction, it has a speed. The idea that there's a single moment when you go from alive to dead is, neurologically speaking, not accurate. Death is a wave, not a switch. And the reason that matters is because of what the same researchers found next. If you reoxygenate the brain in time, that wave of death is followed by a wave of resuscitation. The neurons refuel, they switch back on, and the wave rolls backward. This means the moment of death isn't a hard line you cross. It's a moving window. For a period of minutes, what looks like death from the outside is still, at the cellular level, potentially reversible, which leads directly to what Yale did with pigs in 2019. A team at Yale took pig brains 4 hours after the animals had died and restored circulation and cellular function using a specially designed perfusion fluid. The cells came back. But here's the detail that almost never gets reported. The fluid deliberately contained nerve signal blockers. The team was actively ready to shut down any electrical activity that emerged. They were, in a very real sense, preventing the possibility of the brain switching back on. Because The cells were still capable of it. The moment of death, as a clean, final event, is much more of a myth than most people realize, and the science is only starting to catch up to that. If you're finding this as fascinating as I did when I first went down this rabbit hole, hit subscribe because we go deep on questions like this all the time. And drop a comment. I'm genuinely curious whether the wave of death or the memory surge surprised you more. Now, we've talked about what the brain does electrically, but what about the senses? What's the last thing you're actually aware of? In 2020, researchers at the University of British Columbia ran EEG monitoring on unresponsive hospice patients in their final hours and played them tones and sound patterns. The patients couldn't respond. By all external measures, they were unconscious, but their brains registered the sounds in ways that were statistically indistinguishable from healthy young adults hearing the same tones. Hearing was still fully online. The reason is anatomical. The auditory pathway runs through deep, evolutionarily ancient structures in the brainstem and midbrain that keep functioning long after the cortex starts to go dark. The advice families always get, keep talking to them. They can hear you now has hard neural evidence behind it. That's not just comfort, that's neuroscience. But maybe the most inexplicable thing in this entire topic is what happens in some dementia patients right before they die. It's called terminal lucidity, or sometimes the surge. People who haven't recognized their own children in years suddenly come back. Full clarity, full memory, full personality, sometimes for hours. Of the patients who experience it, most die within a week. About half die within the same day. The brain that supposedly lost those memories permanently retrieves them on the way out. This has been documented since the 1800s, and science still doesn't have a confirmed mechanism. The leading 2021 hypothesis points to a final discharge of neuromodulators acting on preserved circuits in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, essentially the brain finding one last way to be itself. It's one of the most human things in all of neuroscience, and it barely gets talked about. There's also something called hidden consciousness that researchers discovered while studying cardiac arrest patients. In a study tracking 567 people who had gone into cardiac arrest, some who were later resuscitated could describe conversations and events that happened around them while they were supposedly unconscious. To test whether this was real, researchers used a hidden tablet playing recorded words during resuscitation. And some patients could recall what it said. EEG recordings taken during CPR showed near normal brain spikes emerging minutes into resuscitation. Awareness was present in people who showed zero external signs of it. The gap between what the brain is doing and what we can observe from the outside is much wider than medicine has historically assumed. And one final detail that ties all of this together. These end-of-life electrical surges, the gamma spikes, the coherence bursts, show up in a significant portion of dying patients, but researchers checked for the same activity in patients who had already been declared brain dead. Zero. Not a single one. The surge only happens in brains that are still, in some meaningful sense, intact enough to produce it. It requires something to still be there. That's why researchers take it seriously instead of writing it off as electrical static. The brain isn't misfiring randomly at the end. It's doing something that requires the full architecture to still be in place. So here's where we started. Most people picture death as a slow dimming, a quiet fade to black. And here's where the science actually lands. The brain surges, it hyperconnects, it retrieves memories in the exact region where consciousness lives. Death travels through it as a physical wave that, for a window of time, can still reverse. Hearing stays online longer than almost any other sense. And in some people, the brain pulls off one final act of full clarity before it goes quiet for good. We don't fully understand any of this yet, but we understand enough to know the fade to black version of death is wrong. Whatever is happening in those last moments is far more organized, far more structured, and far more human than we ever gave it credit for. If this made you see something differently, share it with someone who would find it as strange as you did. And if you want to keep going down this road, the next video is right there. It's worth watching.